But the interesting thing about the parables to note is what's going on before he launches into a parable story, what's happening after, who is his audience, and why did he respond the way that he did? And I think you'll be surprised to find who his audience was most of the time when he was teaching via parables. In week 6, we're going to revisit something we covered a few years ago. We did a whole study for a few weeks on women who followed Jesus. So we're going to talk about the women specifically who followed Jesus. In week 7, we're going to talk about discipleship, taking up your cross, what it means to love, what it means to being sent. We got a question, Brooke? All right, go ahead and hit it off. Oh, okay, okay. Yeah, I'll put some in. I'll make a video and put it in our Mosaic Bible study group, and I'll try to remember what I just said. Okay, so what else? Where was I at? We're going to talk. Oh, week 7. So week 7 is discipleship. Thank you. Week 7 is discipleship. We're going to talk about the body of Christ, the family of God, the spiritual gifts to support the healthy function of the body. And we'll talk a little bit about, I'll use an example of how Jesus called his disciples, because that shows up in all 4 Gospels. We'll talk about that tonight briefly. Week 8, we're going to talk about transitions. One of the things that never seems to make it into a Sunday sermon are those transitions. You know, where a paragraph starts off, on his way to blank, on his way to this place. While Jesus was doing this opportunity for ministry happened. While he was on his way to heal this person, somebody else was healed. That's the story with Jesus was on his way to heal someone, and the woman with the issue of blood, she interrupts him on his way to get healed. And it's interesting because I think it speaks volumes for us in our busy lifestyles today when we feel like we're being interrupted. And really, it's a God moment, and it's a moment that we probably need to say, wait a minute, is this interruption a God moment, or am I just being interrupted? How do I respond to that? How does Jesus respond to interruptions? And how do the gospel writers transition from one thing to the next in the Gospels? Which brings us to week 9, which is doing versus being and the importance of Sabbath rest. The Sabbath is commandment number 4, I believe, in Exodus, in the Old Testament. And Jesus takes naps at what we might consider, and the disciples certainly considered, the most inopportune times. There's a storm. Where's Jesus? He's asleep. Dude, you're asleep? There's a storm going on. Jesus is like, I know. You woke me up. Like, he's annoyed. One of the other things that I find fascinating or fun about reading the Gospels is how often I imagine that Jesus was annoyed with his disciples, like just frustrated. Anyway. Week 10, I want to talk about marriage and relationships. Marriage separately because Jesus does address it, and a lot of folks don't think that Jesus addresses it, and sometimes people think Jesus's way of addressing it indicates one thing, but actually it indicates something else. And so we're going to talk about that. But just relationships in general, how he related with his disciples and the people around him. Week 11, we're going to talk about faith, hope, and love, failures of faith, promises of hope, and a focus on love. Jesus says in John's Gospel, chapter 13, he says, "You will know my disciples by how they love." But in our modern 2023 context, there's a whole bunch of people running around saying they're disciples or followers of Jesus, and there's nothing about them that indicates they love anybody. And so it makes it hard if you are trying to defend the faith to say, well, you Christians don't show love. Well, then maybe they're not Christians. I'm just saying. Anyway, and in week 12, the reason we follow Jesus now, we follow Jesus because of the resurrection. So we're going to talk about Easter, Palm Sunday, and the historical facts around the eyewitness accounts and how people discussed the resurrection in the early church and how they operated. So that's kind of a big picture overview for the next several weeks, and I will reserve the right to make changes to that as we go based on any questions you guys might have as we go along. So let's see, where do I want to go next with this? All right, well, did you know that the first followers of Jesus didn't have the Bible? They didn't. In fact, they didn't have a bound book that they could walk around with, well, actually for like 1,500 years, but they didn't have anything really put together for at least the first 200 years. An African church father named Tertullian in the 2nd century has probably the first list of what eventually became the canon. The canon simply means that these are the books that we decided on. And they talk about all of that in the How We Got Your Bible book that I mentioned before, but you probably didn't hear me. So Ryan Reeves, How We Got the Bible. And so Christianity predates the Bible. There was an oral tradition. The Gospels, in fact, weren't even written for a few decades until a few decades after the events of the resurrection. So what you have is an oral history that surrounds an event that happened that people were still talking about. In the 2nd century, you have the African church father, church leader Tertullian. He records this list in a letter that he writes to someone else in the church. And he says, these are the books that we're referring to. Because basically what was going on is there were Paul's letters going around. And I think you may have heard Pastor B say just last Sunday, there were actually 4 letters to the church at Corinth. 2 made it into the canon of the Bible. What we considered the Old Testament and what the early church considered the Old Testament are actually not entirely the same thing. So what happens, and we see this in the book of Acts when Paul says the Bereans searched the scriptures for this news of the Messiah, for this information, what they're talking about is that in the early church, some of the people were Jewish, so they had the Old Testament. They had it in Greek, what's known today as the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew text. And so they had that. They had other Jewish writings. And then they were getting letters from Paul. There were copies of gospel accounts floating around. People were sharing them from church to church. Churches met in people's homes back then. They were basically what we would consider small group meetings. Generally less than 100 people, maybe even less than 50 at a time, that would meet together, and they would study the Jewish scriptures to understand better who this Jesus was. But when it came to the New Testament scriptures, it was letters, and some letters became considered more or less authoritative to the point where we had probably dozens of gospel accounts floating around or sayings of Jesus, but only 4 actually made the cut. And so here's the thing when it comes to how we got our Bible. Theology is how we see or understand God, and what we think about God is what the definition of theology is. Orthopraxy is how we practice our beliefs. So the way that you practice, we usually don't hear people say, I'm a practicing Christian, but you will hear people say, I'm a practicing Jewish person, I'm a practicing Muslim. Because they make the distinction between cultural identification and religious identification. And so in the early church, you could culturally or ethnically be Jewish and not be a practicing Christian. Or you could be ethnically Jewish and be a practicing Christian. And all that meant was you already understood or knew the Jewish scriptures or had familiarity about the coming Messiah and that expectation and understanding about God and who God was, to be able to kind of pick up where that leaves off. Orthodoxy, though, is right belief. And this is where pulling all the scriptures together, pulling these letters together and the gospels together, saying, well, what is the right belief? And so when the early church pulled together what was the right belief, the orthodoxy, that's how we end up with received books, rejected books, disputed books, and heretical books. Received, rejected, disputed, and heretical. Let me explain what I mean by that. So if orthodoxy is right belief, in other words, there was this apostolic tradition, the tradition of the elders of the church, the the 12 disciples, the 12 disciples, Paul followed this apostolic tradition. He considered himself, and the other disciples considered him an apostle of Jesus, which simply means to be sent. He was a sent one. So he's writing these letters, sharing this information. Who those people were and what they shared mattered because it was consistent. And that was what led into what was considered the right belief. Anytime somebody showed up with some alternate universe version of things, it was considered heretical, meaning it was way outside the canon, embraced maybe by a few, but it didn't follow the orthodox teaching of the original apostles. So it didn't follow the apostolic tradition. So we're talking about the first couple of hundred years, working our way up to Tertullian saying, here's our list. Not Constantine in the 4th century, but 200 years before that even. So heretical books were books that were way outside orthodox belief, embraced only by a few, didn't follow the orthodox teaching. So those books were like, this is nice. It's a nice story. This is not what we believe. This is not what happened. Think about how when you were during the holidays in the last few weeks, and you were hanging out with family members, and you're recounting Christmas past, or Thanksgiving past, or birthdays past, and there's 4 or 5 people in the room, and everybody's got a different remembrance of what happened. That's why we've got 4 Gospels. But you also have that one person who wasn't there, who heard something, and it was like, no, this is what I thought really happened. And they're repeating it like it's truth, and then the other 5 people who were there go, no, that's not it. Heretical. So there are received books. These are books that are universally accepted by the church. So when Tertullian is making his list, and later church theologians and leaders were making lists of what was going to go into the canon, whether it was Old Testament or New, it was everybody generally agrees on this. Then there were books that were actually rejected, not because they were heretical, but they were rejected because they were only in use by some, and they were just determined to be outside the canon. Remember, this is a theological document. It's helping people believe the right thing, to believe the accurate things about Jesus, about God. And so they want to make sure that what goes into the New Testament, what we remember, because now people, when they start writing the Gospels, people are dying off. They're not remembering. It's kind of like now, they're just now starting to release records from when JFK was shot or when Martin Luther King was assassinated. We'll hear a lot about that this weekend because the King holiday is Monday. And they'll talk about, what really happened, and there'll be documentaries on the History Channel, and they'll say, well, this is what really happened, but we can't talk about it while everybody's still alive because we don't want anybody to know. Well, in the Gospels, they were talking about it while people were still alive. And so I want you to keep that in mind when someone tells you the Bible is not true and not accurate, or that it's made up. When the Gospels were written, there were still people who were eyewitnesses, although it was decades later, who could corroborate these stories. And then you have the received books, universally accepted by the church. You have the heretical books that are way outside the scope of reality. Then you have the rejected books, and it's not that there were anything necessarily wrong with them, they just don't give the theological perspective that followed the apostolic tradition. So they might have been extra things. And I liken that to the way that we look at denominations today within Christianity. The way the Baptists conduct their services versus the way the Methodists conduct their services. Not a big deal, but there's differences, and it's not a big deal, but which direction did the church fathers think was best for the church? So you have received, rejected, heretical. The last one are disputed books. Now these are the books that make it to the History Channel, the bad books of the Bible that didn't make it in. Disputed books, some of those books are books that made it into the Bible, but there's doubts in not content, doubts in usage. Doubts in usage, theological purpose. For example, Ruth, the book of Ruth in the Old Testament is considered a disputed book. it's considered a disputed book because there's no theological anything in it. It's just, hey, here's what happened. And nobody disputed what the book of Ruth says because it gets us from point A to point B, because she's in the lineage of Jesus and she's in the lineage of King David. And so her life mattered and they wanted to include that. I don't know why, but that's why it was considered a disputed book when it came to Christianity. It was part of the Jewish canon, but so were a whole bunch of other books that didn't make it into ours. So received, rejected, disputed, and heretical. I want to kind of make sure that we got that, because the whole point in covering Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is to make sure that we understand the perspective of the life, ministry, and theology of Jesus, because this is really the only place in the Bible where that shows up. Everything else, all of Paul's letters, James, Jude, John, Peter, are interpretations of eyewitness account remembrances of what people heard, saw, and did as a result of how the resurrection of Jesus Christ impacted their lives. And so it's important to understand where all of that goes. And so as we go through the Gospels, I look at this as foundational. Now, here's the thing about the Gospels that we should know. They present 4 different portraits of Jesus. In Matthew, he is, let's see, I was writing in purple. Right, in black for this. In Matthew, Jesus is the king. He's the Messiah king. In Mark, he's presented as the servant. In Luke, he's presented as the ideal man. Some of y'all who grew up in church may have heard preachers say he's the new Adam, like he's Adam 2.0. That is a terrible number 2. There we go. And in John, he is presented as the eternal Son of God. So we've got 4 different perspectives. This is why we have all 4 of these Gospels. There's folks who would say that the Gospels should be read, try to, mishmash, pull them together. And then there's others who say, no, you should take each one as an individual letter. And the reason that I like the vertical scenario the best is that when we try to overlay all the different Gospels, what we miss are the unique qualities or the unique theological qualities of the individual gospel accounts. It's like the reason, and I love documentaries, so the reason that you will watch a documentary and they'll have a professor from one school and a professor that teaches on the same subject from another school, because everybody's lived experience is a little different. And so our perspective is a little different. And then who are we writing this down for? Who is our audience for this? Well, pointing out that Jesus is the Messiah, Matthew is writing to a Jewish audience. He's writing to Jewish Christians. Mark, and most scholars believe Mark's gospel was written first, and that Luke and Matthew got us quite a bit of their information from Mark's gospel. The audience for Mark's gospel were Romans. Now, Paul writes a really long 16-chapter letter to the church at Rome. By the way, the books in the New Testament after the Gospels are ordered based on how long they are. Remember, they were writing on scrolls and papyrus to start with, so it was like, how much paper do we need? And Romans is the longest one, so it's first. And it kind of goes like that. But Mark is writing to the Romans, so he's probably writing to, based on the fact that he translates a number of words from Aramaic. All of this was written in Greek, by the way, in Koine Greek. That he translates words, he's probably writing to Jewish Christians or Romans who converted to Judaism. So while Matthew is writing to people who were ethnically Jewish, Mark is writing to people who had converted to Judaism who are now following Jesus. So they're not ethnically Jewish and Christian, they are like Jewish converts and Christian. and then also, but mostly Gentiles in Rome. And then Luke, or transplanted diaspora Jewish people. Luke is writing to Gentiles. So he's writing to people that are considered Greek or Gentile, which is everybody who's not Jewish. And John is writing to Jewish Christians. And what's interesting about John's gospel is his gospel is the most theological. So Matthew is trying to get everybody to understand. He starts with the genealogy of Jesus, because he's trying to make a case for, hey, he's the Messiah. Here's all the things that happened in his life and ministry that demonstrate that he's the Messiah from a Jewish perspective. Matthew quotes the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the most out of the Gospels for that reason. So with that said, back up here. Matthew is focused, and he is much more structured in his presentation. It's very orderly, it's very structured. This is why we read the Lord's Prayer out of Matthew, not the Lord's Prayer version out of Luke. This is why we read the Sermon on the Mount out of Matthew, and we don't read the Sermon on the Mount. You probably don't even know the Sermon on the Mount shows up in somebody else's gospel. I didn't for a long time. And we'll explore that when we get to the Sermon on the Mount. So Matthew is very structured. Mark is actually quite dramatic. If you read Mark's gospel, it's a lot of drama. It's very, this is the gospel of the suffering Son of God, Jesus as the servant. It focuses on what Jesus did, his works, how he operated, the person and work of Jesus, who he seemed to be as a person, as a human. And it's very dramatic. Matthew, on the other hand, very structured. Lots of Old Testament Septuagint quotes trying to make his argument. When we get to Luke, Luke is very historical, and that's evident in how Luke begins. Luke begins very historically. He's like, well, I interviewed some people, and I'm writing all this down for my good buddy Theophilus so that he knows what happened. And so Luke writes the Gospel of Luke, and then right behind it, he writes the Acts of the Apostles. So he continues the story, and for many, many, many years, they were put together or bound together as one complete story, one complete historical record of what happened. But John is the most theological. Here's where we have the 7 I am statements, theological. We have the most miracles. We have in John, he's writing to the same audience or same type of audience that Matthew is, but he's writing much later than Matthew and Luke and Mark. And he's writing all this down, and he tells you in his gospel towards the end so that you guys won't forget, so that you understand. But he's trying to, in his gospel, counter what were likely heretical teachings that were already going around. See, one of the things that we get wrong about the Jewish people in this time period is that they were a homogenous group of people, but they actually weren't. There were at least 9 different factions of Judaism in the time of Christ. That's why one of Jesus' disciples is referred to as the zealot. Well, he's a zealot because he was like ready to take up arms. He was all ready to be January 6th about the Romans having control over Judea, over Palestine, over Israel, over that area. He was part of that group of people. They were ready to go fight for their country. And so it's important to understand that we're not talking about a homogenous group of Jewish people. You have people who are Jewish converts to Judaism. You have people who are ethnically Jewish. You have people who were born and raised in the Jerusalem region in Judea. And then you have people like Paul who were born and raised in what is now modern-day Turkey, out in the diaspora, and grew up speaking Greek first, Hebrew as a scholarly or religious language. So any of you who grew up Catholic and had to learn Latin in order to operate and function at church, you understand where they're coming from. Most people who were adherents to Judaism in the time of the Gospels or in the time of Christ were not necessarily speaking Hebrew just one to another. They were speaking it for religious reasons more than anything else if they didn't live in the area where people were natively Hebrew. Jesus very likely spoke all three, Aramaic, Hebrew, and Koine Greek, and operated in those places. But these are the things that are important when we look at the four portraits of Jesus. John was theological, and because John is so theological, we're not going to spend a whole lot of time. We're going to focus a lot of our time on what are known as the synoptic gospels, which is Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And if you are, well, I think I have room. I can keep it. I don't need to start this over. Let's see. Change my marker color. I got another picture for you guys. So 4 pictures, 4 portraits of Jesus, 4 different versions of the story, 4 different ways of looking at this. Now, let me also point out that Gospels, usually the way that we try to explain it from a literary standpoint is that they are biographical in nature. But ancient Eastern biographies are different than the autobiography of Malcolm X that we have now. Like, we don't, the way we as American or English-speaking people write a biography, where we start when somebody's born and go all the way through their death, is not the way that biographies were done in ancient times. Mostly because it starts out as an oral tradition, an oral remembrance. Nobody was really paying attention to Jesus except for Mary, which we find that out in Luke. That's the only reason we've got all the information about Mary, because Luke went and interviewed her. But when we look at the other Gospels, it's not so much that they're trying to figure out what was Jesus doing. These gaps in his life are really because nobody cared. And the Gospels that you might hear about on the History Channel documentary of the books that didn't make it into the Bible, the infancy of Jesus or the Gospel of Thomas or sayings of Jesus, these are books that nobody could corroborate. So if nobody can corroborate this is what Jesus did when he was 5, guess where it didn't make it? Into the canon of the Bible. It was like, does it matter what he did when he was 5? Nobody cared. So what does matter, though, to our study as we move forward is to kind of be able to place how what's known as the 3 synoptic gospels work together. So I'm going to attempt to draw a quick picture for you guys of the synoptic gospels. And these are Mark, Luke, and Matthew, or Matthew, Luke, and Mark. So let's see. I'm going to draw a circle here. I'm going to write MK for Mark. I'm going to draw a circle here, write an L for Luke, draw a circle here, and write an MT for Matthew. There we go. And so what you have is, because a lot of what Matthew and Luke have in their Gospels corroborates back to Mark, scholars believe that they probably referred to Mark's Gospel in writing theirs. It's kind of like when you are writing a paper for school and you do research and you read somebody else's paper or book or thesis and you say, yeah, those are some really good ideas. I'm going to include that in my paper. So that's where you have with Matthew and Luke. You get information from that. So there's stories or parts of the account that are in Matthew and Mark, but only in Matthew and Mark. And then there are parts of the account that are in Luke and Mark, and only in Luke and Mark. And then there's accounts that are only in Matthew and Luke. And then there's stuff that's only unique to Matthew, and things that are only unique to Luke, and only unique to Mark. And then there's stories that show up in everybody. And that is my very, very simplistic overview of the Synoptic Gospels. I'm happy to answer questions, but I want to keep it simple because, this could get really complicated really fast with percentages and all of that. But I want you to understand that what's going on in Matthew and Mark and Luke and John it does overlap, but there are parts of them that don't, and that's okay. That's why they're there. And we're going to actually look at some of the differences tonight. And so a couple of things I want to share with you as we start to wrap this up. And then I'm going to give you some passages to look at on your own time. We'll actually talk about them in here, but those of you online, I'll give you the passages to look at on your own time. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, what I want you to know about those, about the Synoptic Gospels, is that they emphasize the Galilean setting of the first part of Jesus' ministry. Very little information is given to determine the length of Jesus' ministry. The material that's presented in the Synoptic Gospels could fit into 1 year. Jesus teaches mostly in parables, short sayings, and clever remarks here and there as he's responding to people. And the teaching focuses in the Synoptic Gospels on the kingdom of God. Healing and exorcisms demonstrate the power of the kingdom and the dawn of eschatological salvation. Now, I had to look up eschatological because for some reason I have a mental block to what that word means every time I see it. And I looked it up again because I was like, you know what? If I can't remember, y'all probably don't know either. So it means relating to death, judgment, and the final destiny of the soul or of humankind. So it has to do with where we go when all of this is said and done. And so John's gospel, though, being more theological, there's a considerable amount of movement between Galilee and Judea. It mentions at least 3 different Passover feasts, and so we can assume, and this is where we get this from, that Jesus' ministry was at least 2.5 to 3 years in length. It relates long speeches by Jesus, dialogues with his opponents, and interviews with individuals, because John is identified as one of Jesus's disciples. The way that Matthew is written, no one's entirely certain, scholars aren't, that Matthew himself wrote it necessarily, but he may have dictated it to someone and using Mark's gospel as a basis. And Luke interviewed everybody, so he wasn't one of the original 12. So we know that right from the beginning. John, however, was, and he was likely the youngest one, so he's got the clearer memory. He's also the one who wrote the Revelation at the end of the New Testament. His teaching in his gospel, though, focuses on Jesus himself and the Son's revelation of the Father, and their signs or miracles in John's gospel reveal Jesus' identity and glorify the Father. But guess what's missing from John's gospel? Exorcisms. There's no casting out of demons. So it's very interesting because depending on which gospel is your favorite gospel to read, this is how we end up with differences in denominations, because you get someone who says, well, I like John, I'm gonna go with him. And then you grow up thinking nobody ever need to exorcise demons. And then you read Mark and you're like, whoa, Jesus is doing exorcisms right out the gate. Like, this is important. So the differences as we explore the various gospels, the Synoptic Gospels and the Gospel of John, which is really more of a theological account of what is Jesus' ministry and teaching, we'll see those differences. And so what I'm going to give you for homework and things to think about the differences between these. In Matthew, I want you to read chapter 4, verses 18 through 22. In Mark, read chapter, I'm going to write it above it, 1, verses 16 through 20. In Luke, read chapter 5, 1 through 11. And in John, read chapter 1, verses 35 through 51. It's a little bit longer. All 4 of those accounts cover Jesus calling his first disciples. Yeah, sure. Okay, I'll start with Matthew. Matthew chapter 4, red is hard to see from back there. Brooke, can you see it on the screen? I'll write over it in purple. Okay, chapter 4, verse 18 through 22 in Matthew. Mark is chapter 1, 16 through 20. Luke is chapter 5, verses 1 through 11. John is chapter 1, verses 35 through 51. And what I'd like you guys to do is to look at what are the differences in each of these accounts of Jesus calling his first disciples. What's the same? What's different? If we think of the Gospels as someone's personal account reflecting an oral tradition from eyewitnesses decades later, how does that affect your perspective of their authenticity? How do you think the early church viewed them? How do you think the apostolic tradition evolved out of these oral traditions that were floating around? And then the last thing I want you to look at as you're studying these this week is the context. What I mean by context is what's going on before each of these passages, what's going on or happens after each of these passages, what's going on before and what is happening after each of these passages. And the reason is because it gives you a little bit of insight in how that author believed that telling the story to show that Jesus is the Messiah, that he is the servant, this humble servant of God, that he's the ideal man, the Adam 2.0, that he is the Son of God, factors into each of those passages, how they recount Jesus gathering his first disciples. Amen. So thank you so much for joining us. Those of us who are in the sanctuary, we're actually going to take the time. We're going to look at each of those passages and discuss it. But those of you online, thank you for joining me. And I look forward to being with you again next week. Have a great evening.